How's everybody?
Good, very good.
We've had several already asking about books, so.
Okay.
Selfies.
That'll be fine.
Yeah, they don't mind. Let Bobby say give back some of her famous sliders. So.
Yeah, I'm kind of fond of those.
Yeah, I've got some there. So we'll go ahead and get started. I think everybody knows Joe. Most of you know him as the McMinn County Sheriff, but he also has many other hidden talents. He's a prolific writer. He's written 8 books, and he's here to talk about his newest book, The Indian Boundary Fireside Companion. And I'm going to turn it over to Joe. Yes?
And we will ask you to silence your phones, please.
Oh yeah, good point.
She's probably talking to me. What are you fact checking me there? While you showed up, make sure I was gonna tell the truth. Oh, make sure I was on time. Well, yeah, I appreciate it, Hank. So, well, thank you all for coming. What really wasn't expecting this big of a crowd, but I appreciate you guys showing up. I do have this new book out about the Indian Boundary. I think most of you all probably know where that's at, or may have camped up there from time to time. So, where it came from, about 4 years ago, my family and I were up there camping, and we started telling stories about the campground and the surrounding areas, and a lot of stories were stuff that we had been telling for years, and the kids and everybody was really enjoying it. So my brother said, "Why don't you write some of this stuff down?" And I've really never thought about it before, and so of course, being a sheriff takes a lot of your time, so I didn't immediately get started on it, but after a while I started putting a few things together, and then Stephanie and I, we kind of did this one together. She always takes all the pictures for the books, but the other books use a lot of historic pictures that we reproduce, and she takes some of the other ones, but she took every picture, just about every picture in this book, and so it gave us a time to kind of do some things together. There's a particular story in there that we had a lot of fun with, and she just did a blog. She posted today. She posted a blog. If you follow thewhinyhiker.com, you can read that. So, who's heard of Jeffrey's Hell up in the Tellico Mountains? I've heard about it for years. I've heard a vague story about it. But there was something else that happened up there that I wasn't aware of, and it turns out in the 1920s, in 1925, they were logging that area. The Babcock Lumber Company was, and there was a particularly dry summer that year, and that September, everything had gotten really, really just dry in the forest. And of course, they were using steam engines back then to trace and haul the logs out. There were communities up in the mountains, very similar to the way it was down here in Polk County, especially in the lumber company. There were lumber camps up there, and of course there were schools and churches and everything in those camps. Sometimes they lived in tents and just shanties, and sometimes they would actually build buildings. Sometimes they would live in rail cars that they would pull up there. They used this particular kind of engine, It's called a Shay locomotive. And these Shay locomotives were specifically built for power. They weren't built for speed or anything. They were built for power. And the way the pistons drove the engine made it specifically adept for climbing steep grades and hauling really, really heavy loads. And they weren't very big engines compared to a lot of other engines. That was something else too. They were able to negotiate the twists and turns of those mountain railroads that sometimes were just laid on the ground. So they were up there logging, and there's a particular area there. It's known as Double Camp today, and that was sort of the nexus of the Cityco area lumbering. And what they had done, they had logged the Tellico area, the Tellico River area, all the way up into North Carolina, and then they had moved their operations over the mountains on the other side of Indian Boundary today, and came up. They kind of went around the mountains and come up the Little Tennessee River and built railroads up that way, and come up from Von Orr and built the rail line up through there and logged those hollows and things out. So they'd gotten back to Jeffrey's Hill. It's right above Double Camp, what we know as Double Camp today. And there was an area down there, they called it Jeffrey. Of course, Jeffrey's Hill, the story behind the name was there was supposedly a hunter up there, an old guy that lived up in the area, and he was out hunting with some friends, and he had 2 prize hunting dogs, probably mountain curs. And that particular area lies east of the north and south forks of the Cityco, going over up into North Carolina toward the state line, and it's extremely, extremely rugged. Overgrown and tangled with mountain laurel. If you've ever tried to hike or walk or hunt in mountain laurel and had to crawl out like I have, you know what that's like. I mean, it's you don't have this much visibility around you anywhere. Bears and hogs really like those places, and so you might hear a hog between me and you, as you well know, and you can't even see it, but you know it's there. So they're very dangerous. They're very scary, even during the day. There are places in broad daylight that it'll be dark in there because of the overgrown area of the forest. And they call them hills, laurel hills. So they were hunting up in that area, and somehow Jeffrey lost his dogs. And the story went that he said, "I'm going to go get my dogs." And they said, "Well, you can't. Nothing ever comes out of that. They've lost livestock. The people have been lost in there." And he said, I'll get my dogs or I'll go to hell. Well, he never came out. And so they never found him, never saw his dogs again. And that was in the late 1800s, supposedly, when that happened. That's more of a legend. But nevertheless, there's probably some truth to it because the people call that area Jeffrey's Hill. And so that makes me think that that's probably a pretty factual based story. So anyway, when the railroad moved up in there, they would have post office at those camps. Well, the Postal Service felt like that Jeffrey's Hill was just too vulgar to put on a postage stamp, and so they just called it Jeffrey. And so they were logging the area of Jeffrey where the creek splits, and it's beautiful up there. And Stephanie remarks today in her blog about how beautiful it is up there. It's very, very remote, very, very rugged, but just beautiful. Cityco Creek winds up in there and then splits. Well, the railroad split there too, and one went on the South Fork, and one rail went up on the North Fork. So up above Jeffrey, they're logging up there that day in September of 1925, and they smelled smoke, which wasn't uncommon. There was a lot of fires that break out periodically, but they normally burn themselves out or be put out. Well, they kept smelling smoke, and sure enough, this wall of fire came over the mountain on the backside of Flats Mountain and started roaring down the valley toward the community. Well, there were 2 Shay engines down around Double Camp, and they actually had telephone lines up there at the time. So somebody up in Jeffrey made a phone or call down to the main lumber camp there in Double Camp and told them, "Hey, we're about to be burned up here." and people were running as best they could, even down the out of the valley, from what we know. And so there were 2 Shea engines down there, and 2 engineers jumped on those engines with a fireman and started up into the Jeffries Hill area. And they drove the engines up there. One took the North Fork and one took the South Fork. The one that took the North Fork shuttled close to 100 people on the flat cars that they normally carried the logs on and got them out. But the fire was burning closer to the South Fork, and so when that engineer got up in there, he loaded some people up. But as they were coming back out, they got trapped by the fire, by this raging forest fire. Luckily, as you're coming out of that area, the creek up in there runs through this big flat area, and this everything I'm telling you is documented by the 2 engineers and some of the people that were up there. So he sees that, and it had already been burnt over. So he stopped the train and told everybody to run for that clearing. And this is in the middle now of this forest fire burning all around them. And so they made it to the clearing except for 2 people, and they're mentioned in the book. On the train was a deputy sheriff, and he shows up in a lot of pictures from that area. And so I assume the sheriff at the time in Monroe County just had that particular deputy stationed up in that area. And so he was on the train. Well, these 2 guys had been running some liquor up there, and they had some liquor on them. And they don't know if they just panicked or they saw the deputy sheriff and were worried that they were going to get put in jail because they had the whiskey. You'd think they would have thought he'd overlooked that in the middle of the forest fire. So instead of going to the clearing, they went downstream. And just a little bit downstream is a little waterfall, and they tried to get up under the waterfall. But like I said, it had been a very, very dry summer. So the forest fire burns on down the mountain, burns over the railroad track, catches the train on fire, burns it, destroys the train, but the people don't get burned. A little singed and smoke scarred, but as the fire burns on by, they walk out. And a few days later, they notice those 2 guys are still missing, and so they go up in there, and the folks who went back to search for them said that the fish in the creek were all dead. They had literally boiled. The water had gotten so hot, but they found those 2 guys' bodies partially up under that ledge where that waterfall comes off, which was barely a waterfall at the time, and they both burned up. And so they were the only 2 people that died, and they would have survived if they'd stayed in that particular area. So it was kind of fun to go up in there with. We took a whole day, and we sort of knew the general area. We had some maps and those first-hand accounts of the people that were involved in it, specifically the 2 engineers. And to go back in there and the trail eventually gets back on the rail bed, and you go up in there, and even where the Y is, where the railroad split, that's easily seen. There's a picture of it in there. The railroad actually crossed the creek to go up the North Fork of the Citico, the one that the train went up that they were able to get back down without any damage. That trail has a bridge that goes across the original abutments that held up the railroad bridge. And then, so we turned right and walked up in there to where the train was destroyed, and were able to kind of piece together about where that happened based on the topography, and there's no signs at all up there. And so it was just kind of neat being up there. We didn't know that. We didn't know any of this. But as we were researching stories and researching history about it, we came across the Jeffries Hill fire. And so this is another little neat connection. Who has been through Townsend lately? You better go through Townsend, go to the Pigeon Forge, yeah. So in Townsend, there is a railroad museum, the Little River Railroad. Now I've been by 1,000 times. I stopped there one time and looked around, and so I started looking for. It's always neat to me. You think, well, what if we could find these engines? And so I started going, doing a lot of online research, and the engine numbers, we knew what they were. 2147, and I forget what the other one was. So the second engine that had burned up, they wound up pulling it out of the mountains, rebuilding it, and using it for the rest of the operations there. And there's photographs of it after the fire, photographs of the damage to it during the fire, and photographs after it was rebuilt. They finished operating in the Citico area, along with engine 2147. And so when they finished logging up there, engine 2147, that was the one that survived the fire, was the last Shea engine to pull a load of lumber out of the mountains. Well, Babcock sold those engines to the Little River Lumber Company, and they used them in the Townsend area up into the 1930s as they logged that area up until the National Park was formed up there. So they sold the engines after they logged up there, and 2147 was also the engine, coincidentally, that hauled the last load of logs out of the mountains around Townsend. So the other engine, the one that had been damaged and rebuilt, that we hiked up into to write that story, all I can ever find on it, there's actually a Shea engine group that there are people that buy these things and rebuild them, or they keep up with them. And that particular engine, about 1940, was sold somewhere. I forget now where they sold it, and it was scrapped. So there's no trace of it left. But I kept seeing 2147, and I found this one reference that it was in Robbinsville, North Carolina. And so we drove over to Robbinsville one day and drove all over the place looking for this engine that was supposed to be sitting on the side of the road. There was no engine over there, and so we were still doing some research, and I found it again, and associated with the Little River Railroad Company. So sure enough, we drive up there, and that train that I've driven by 1,000 times is 2147. That was in this story that we wrote. And so I contacted the museum up there, and we stopped by one day and took some pictures of it for the book. But one of those that luckily is the one, and it was in in Robbinsville, from about 1940 until the 1990s. And they bought that thing and shipped it somehow. I still haven't figured out how they did that. Back to Tennessee. The governor of North Carolina and the governor of Tennessee both had to make gubernatorial declarations to change the laws of commerce because, and I don't know the whole story, but something about the engine was so big and heavy, it actually was against the law to move it over public rails and public roads. But to get it over here, they both agreed they would make an exception for that one engine to be moved and get it back over to Townsend, and that's of course it's been up there and it's been restored. So a lot of neat stories like that up there that were truthful that we kind of came across, and we had a lot of fun, like I say, hiked way back in there and found those places. There's a lot of ghost stories up there. We always enjoyed sitting around the campfires and telling ghost stories, and we interviewed some people in the book that had worked at Indian Boundary in the National Forest for a long time, and those guys are in there. That one of them is a guy that's been at basically up there about almost 30 years or so. His name is Gennis Best, and Gennis was a campground host up there, and now he's a volunteer, and he's a minister, so you know you can trust him. He's a long time, just a wonderful, wonderful guy. We drove up before the season opened, and he just volunteers up there. He doesn't get paid. He takes care of all the maintenance around the campground. And the people that run the campground store are friends of ours, and they, in the old maintenance area, they let them pull their campers up there, and they basically live up there while they're working at Indian Boundary. So Gennis was just a wealth of knowledge. His grandfather was Jake Best, and if you know anything about that area, if you go way on past Double Camp and you're driving that little road that comes back out of the mountains down in Von Orr, you pass Jake Best Campground, and because his grandfather was or his great grandfather, I guess would be now, was one of the pioneer people that moved up there and established a home and built a church and lived up there. And actually, there's a campground that carries his name, and so he's got a lot of connections to the area. But he was a wealth of knowledge. He knew a lot of people who have within the past 5 or 10 years, a lot of people up there have passed away that worked up there, that was up there where it was built. I had a lot of friends and I regret now not talking to them about this, because they were just older gentlemen, some former rangers and employees up there that we shared an interest in, and we'd share some stories, but I never really pinned them down and got them to tell me the history of it. And they've all kind of passed away, and Genesis is like the last connection to those guys. So there was a community up there around Indian Boundary called White Oak Flats, and there's a lot of neat little stories that have to do with it. He could still tell you where some of the people lived up there, and there was a school up there. All that, of course, is all gone. When the National Forest came in and bought all that property up, and they realized they were going to build that development with the campground and the lake, then they tore all that down. The Forestry Service is not known for preservation. And I got a lot of friends in the Forestry Service, and they do a lot of great work, but they're a timber management organization, whereas the National Park Service, that's why you have places like Cades Cove. They don't like to tear stuff down as much. They'll tear a lot of stuff down, but they'll leave some things. Forestry Service, if it's standing and they buy it, it's gone. And even in Jeffrey, when we walked up in Jeffrey, Stephanie and I found some remnants of some of the homes and buildings up there. There's still an old fireplace that we found, and some other little foundations and some other stuff up there. But Indian Boundary's that way. There's no trace really of any of those homes or the school or anything. But Genesis was able to tell us a lot of neat stuff. There's a couple of stories in the book, of course, that they're just purely ghost stories. I mean, there's nothing truthful to them. Necessarily, but they're stories that we've heard up there for years, that we've told up there for years. The lake is, if you've ever been up there, it's a beautiful place, but the lake is kind of creepy. And so there's a lot of neat stories about the lake, and maybe something's living in the lake. And then there's a trail that goes around the lake that's kind of neat. There's a story about it. There's a sort of a humorous story about Bigfoot being up there, and you all know that there are Bigfoot sightings in our area. Did you know that? Yeah. Somebody's like, "I've seen him." So there's a Bigfoot group. There's a Bigfoot website locally that there's a Bigfoot museum just down south in Blue Ridge. For some friends of ours on a farm outside of Inglewood that's actually documented in the big Bigfoot museum out in California they were at. And so there's quite a bit of that. It's purely just for entertainment, though, in the book. I don't know who that guy is in the Bigfoot suit. So we had a lot of fun writing it, and I took a different path of getting it published to try something else, and so far it's working out pretty good for us. So, anybody got any questions about anything about the book or anything that I've written? Yeah.
Are there directions how to get to these places you're talking about in the book?
Yeah, some. I think I included how to get to Jeffrey and on the right trail that gets you back in there, and a couple of other places. Yeah, I've given some directions to some of that. Yeah.
Have you ever come across anyone named Mason Evans?
I came across where he's been, but
Is that
yeah.
kind of a similar where Jeff means?
Well, no. A similar area?
Yeah.
No, Mason was predominantly down here on Star Mountain. He never really roamed any further than maybe Inglewood and Mount Vernon. I've never even seen any documentation he made it even as far as Tellico. He really stayed around the Rural Vale area, the Brown Hill area, just right around the mountain there. He just never really wandered too far off. The only time he was ever even in Athens was when they went over there and caught him and brought him to the courthouse, and that's where the picture comes from. And he's on the cover of one of those books. And there's some stories about Star Mountain, about Mason in there too. And there's some Polk County stories in there. You guys have got a pretty fascinating history down here. Is Thurman Parish in here? Is he? Thurman Parish. Thurman is you guys have got one of the best historians in Thurman Parish. I never come to Polk County and talk about your history without invoking the name of Thurman. Do y'all know who I'm talking about?
Yeah.
He's a great guy and so knowledgeable, and I've learned so much from him, and I never want to leave him out, because a great deal of what I write about, either everything about that story I know from Thurman, or he's gotten me started looking at things a little bit differently. And so he's a real gem, and I'm glad to see him putting more stuff on Facebook. I try to post stuff and encourage him, hey, because he's kind of a hermit. He just kind of likes to stay on his own, and great guy though, and just has some of the best pictures and best stories. Again, somebody that really knows a lot about the National Forest area, specifically in the Polk County area. There is a girl I found out 2 weeks ago who has written. She publishes with the History Press. Published those 3 books right there. She's published several books with the History Press about national forests and the history involved in them. And she's actually working on one about the Cherokee right now. And I think we have a mutual friend oh goodness gracious, he's retired Forestry Service guy I was in Overhill with. His name is escaping me. I know him like I know myself. Anyway, he messaged me and said that he had been in contact with her, and she had given her my name and Thurman Parish's name, and which he just should have referred her to Thurman, and that'd been fine. So hopefully she's working on that, and she'll be writing some other stuff. And that's kind of what I hope about the Indian Boundary book. It's not a complete history of the area. We kind of wrote it just for that site, for people that camp up there, that fish up there, that kind of know the area, to sort of read around the campfire, read around the campground. But it's got some neat stories in it anyway. But that's predominantly where kind of what we wrote it for. And we hope that will cause more conversation and more research and other folks to look at that stuff too, and maybe some more stories to come out, and more sources and documentation to come out, because so many people have passed away that used to live in the mountains, as you all well know, even down here, that those stories are being lost. And if somebody doesn't go and write about those things, then they're going to be gone forever. And that's why I really always brag on Thurman, because of just 4 or 5 books now that he's written just about this area, really saving that history. So anything else? Any other questions?
One time Thurman came over to talk to me, and I went to look him up when he lived on Welcome Drive Road, I guess it was that Old Federal, whatever it was. And I asked him, I was looking for him, and I went to Frog Lee, and Frog said, now, Thurman knows a lot, and that's the one you want to get in touch with it. But if you want to really hear some news, talk to my mother. That's Frog Lee's mother. She was 82 years old, and this has been, I don't know how many years ago.
Well,
I sit down and listen to that woman tell stories about Polk County that I try to remember, because if you repeat something, you better know what you're talking about. And she told me so many stories that a lot of people don't even know the other side. She was a little girl growing up there, and she told me these things that happened. And I'm like you, I wish I would have written them down, but I didn't have the opportunity.
Right.
And now they're gone.
Yeah.
And I hope my memory is as good.
Yeah.
I think it
Yeah.
is.
Yes, sir.
Was Indian Boundary built by the CCC?
No, it wasn't actually built until the 60s. There's some CCC references in there in one of the stories that on the Tellico River, they built most of those campgrounds, and there was a camp at Spivey Cove, and there's a story in there about Spivey Cove, and it mentions the CC camp, and it's marked up there. There's a little marker, and some of the foundations are there, and the the campground is actually built. When you look at old pictures of there were these buildings that stair-stepped up the ridge, and there's campgrounds or campsites in those places now. But no, it's actually built by the Forestry Service, and here's the weird part about all this research. Where do you think I would go first to write about something in the National Forest? The forestry. And I did. And I'm not much of a conspiracy theorist. But there are no records of Indian boundary being built. Now, I'm just telling you. If they are, they have not found them yet. And I've been asking and requesting. They know they've seen them, but nobody can seem to find them. I've talked to friends of mine at the Cleveland office. They say that about 10, 15 years ago, that you know how smart the federal government is. So somebody comes down in the upper echelon of the National Forest Service and says, we're going to consolidate all the records. And so they took all the records and supposedly took this area's records or this region's records and put them in at the Unicoi station in Irwin. Well, you call up there, and I've been working with a very friendly employee up there who's in land acquisition. He says, I can't find the records. If you get online, you cannot find anything except just the barest of information about who built it, when it was built, specifically how much. I'm yet to see a dollar figure anywhere in any documentation that says how much it even cost to build that up there. Now I know there are people, I know it got built. There are still people living who worked on it, but they're all getting up in age now. But it was built by the Forestry Service. The Army Corps of Engineers had something to do with it. They either built the dam or consulted with the Forestry Service on how to build the dam. Of course, that's their specialty. But I've got folks saying, yeah, they built it, and other folks telling me they just consulted with them on it. And I don't have any documentation to say either way. And I'm still waiting to find some of that stuff. And I mentioned that in the book. It's part of the mystery, I guess, of it, is you can't find records. And you'd think a federally funded project, I'm required to do every little thing I do at the sheriff's office, just like Sheriff Ross is, keep records of all that, and you can't find anything. So it's very odd. But yeah, that's kind of who built it in the mid-'60s. From what I understand, they built the campground first, which I think is very weird. They built the campground and then built the lake. So that required quite a bit of engineering to build a lake and not flood the campground that was already there. So, kind of impressed with that. What else? Anything else?
Can you tell us a little more about the other books you brought?
Yeah, these other books are my publisher kind of stole that from me, but I'm letting it go because it's been so good to me. We started publishing some books with the History Press back several years ago. I published the McMinn County book first, and then the East Tennessee book and the Southeast Tennessee book, and I just call it the Hidden History of those places. So now they have a whole Hidden History division, and they've never paid me a penny to use that. But
they're your books.
Oh, these are my books. I mean, they have a whole hidden history of Boston, but they started off with mine. Yeah, mine was the first one. But they've been really good to me, so we're going to let that slide.
Well, what about other people who are interested? What about if other people are interested? Are you going to let that slide?
If other people are interested.
How about the other people that are interested in those books? Are you going to let that slide?
Well, I mean, what I mean is the publisher kind of used that as a marketing tool for their. So that's
business.
That's business. So you were asking about the Mason Evans book. I'm kind of proud of that cover. I didn't come up with the cover. That's all. We did this one, but these are all done by the publisher. But that actually won an award for the publisher. We went down there. They're located in Mount Pleasant, just right outside of Charleston, South Carolina. And so we were just down there on vacation back a few years ago, and I wanted to go and meet in person the editors that I'd worked with. And so we go in the were you with me when I went went in the office? I don't remember if you were probably having a babysitter at the time. So I go in down there, and we're talking in this conference room, and they're telling me how well the book's doing and everything. At the time, it was just this one. And I look up on the wall, and there's a huge poster of this thing. And first I just thought, well, they just did that because I was coming down here to make me feel good. and so we got through with our meeting. I was going to go back over to the beach with Stephanie and the kids, and I said, yeah, that's just neat. I appreciate you putting that up here. And he said, oh, that's up there because we won an award for that cover, a national award. It was up there, and there was 3 other book covers up there, but they actually won a national award for that. So it got a little more exposure that way. Each of those books they're basically set up the same way. There's just some things I like to write about. I like Cherokee stories. I like any story that you're not going to just go out and see in a local history book. Things that you're only going to find if you really look through an old newspaper or something that's just been handed down, or just some hidden history.
Do you ever put any secretive stuff in there only you and other people would understand? Does that make sense?
Yeah. I won't say never. Maybe without meaning to. I think sometimes maybe I do. Let's see. There's Cherokee stories. There's I like weird little. I just love local government. I love the things that go on in these small counties and small cities. And so sometimes there's some government stories in there. Just people's behavior just fascinates me, and people in general do. And so when they do funky things and sometimes even humorous things, sometimes terrible things, I think that's just kind of neat. The situations that people find themselves in our area, and that to me that's the most fun I have. Is none of that's really made up. It's stuff that happens in this area, and it happened in our history here in Polk and Monroe and McMinn and Meigs County. That you don't have to make it up. I mean, it's stuff that really happened and went on. I like the Civil War. I like colonial times. I like Tennessee history, and so things that have to do with the founding of Tennessee history, especially if there's any local connection. And like I say, local Civil War stories that touch here in this area. Moonshiners and law enforcement, of course, is something that interests me, and things that old sheriffs did in Polk and McMinn and Monroe County, things they had to deal with. Some of the stories in there, every now and then there'll be a family story. Like you say, it's only something that maybe me or a few other people know. But, I mean, I grew up, I won't say we were poor, but we had we just had what we needed. My grandparents were poor, but they farmed. My grandpa on my mother's side lives where we live. I live on his farm now, and he farmed all day and then worked a second shift job in a salt factory in Nyota my whole life. And my grandmother had worked in factories years ago. But they lived in the country, and so they would have to figure out ways to commute. My grandfather, for a short period of time, was like a lot of people in this area. When Oak Ridge got started, he was a security guard up there for a short time. And if you know a little bit about the history of Oak Ridge, you know there were some spies up there that sold some secrets to the Russians in the 50s. Do you remember? Do you remember their names? I don't either. It's slipping me. But Papa could remember seeing them, and remembered when the FBI and everybody came down. And Papa was just an old country guy, old country farmer, and he said we just called them the trench coat men because that's what that's how they kind of stood out up there. But it was so hard to go back and forth up there. I think he took there was a bus that ran up there, and there may have been one from Benton too. And so he only worked a few years up there, but that's who he was, and had about a 5th grade education, but had some very neat old stories about things that happened when they were younger. There's a story in there about a Christmas that, and there was a modern connection to it. Something got lost in when one of my my great-grandfather was a bit of a spoiled brat as a child, and he destroyed his Christmas present, but it gets found later, years and years later, and I have that in my possession now. And so there's a neat little story in there that was passed down into my family, but it's not anything unique, I think, to our family. I think it's just how country people live and things that country people do and the way that they look at things. My grandfather in Etowah was a police officer for his whole career, a World War II veteran, native of Polk County, and but those two men were so similar. They were very quiet. They were very faithful men, very even-tempered. And it's just amazing how similar the two of them were, and they both just, if you pushed them a little bit, they'd tell you things. And where Papa Morgan knew more and lived in that country atmosphere and could tell things about the farms and the area and the land, Papa Guy, of course, could tell me a lot of things about law enforcement. He also worked at one of the local funeral homes and had a lot of good stories about it. And some of those are in there. And so a lot of this is just stuff that I've just kind of soaked up over the years. I'm kind of like you. I would sit and listen to old people talk all day long when I was younger. And I've tried to remember a lot of that stuff. And I finally got smart and started writing stuff down years ago just in notes. And so I've dug a lot of that back out, and those kind of come up in those stories too. Then they're based on a lot of public records, other people's writings. Like I say, Thurman Parish's stuff kind of boils up in there a little bit in some of those stories. And so there's, when you talk about the old, you can't hardly talk about the Old Dutch settlement, that what people know about that today, and not mention Thurman Parish because of what he's done, the people he's interviewed. I've been down there with another guy that's done some work down there. He was kind enough to walk me down there and show me those home sites, and I knew about the Old Dutch settlement, or I got introduced to the Old Dutch settlement in a Cleveland State class. I don't know if anybody knew Catherine Truitt. She was a historian in Bradley County and taught at Cleveland State. Wonderful lady, and I regret that she passed away before she. I'd love to have told her this is the result of you teaching some knucklehead early 20s. Couldn't ever be on time for class guy. But I loved her classes. They were so neat. And she would bring a lot of this regional history out. And some of the things that she taught us have wound up in those books. But the Old Dutch settlement was something that always intrigued me. My dad knew a little bit about it. And eventually, because of Thurman and some more information, I was able to go back down there. And then since then, Thurman's written another book, as you well know, and really talks even more in depth about the settlement and its founding, the founders or the families, what happened to it, what happened to some of the families that were down there. And so, again, there's just so much neat stuff in our area. You don't have to look too far for stuff to write about. I never have writer's block. There's always something to write about. I'll end with this. It's our bicentennial in McMinn County right now. We're 200 years old. In November 13th, will be our 200th birthday of the day that the legislation was passed forming McMinn and Monroe County out of the Hiwassee Purchase. You all were still Cherokee land down here, and would be for several more years. We were all in Bradley County. We were literally on the frontier back then. And so I'm helping with that because I'm the county historian up there in McMinn too. And so one of the radio stations that asked me to record these little 1 minute, like a minute of history. And so I sat down and literally in one night wrote 10 or 11 of them. And I remember just remarking to myself, there is no end to this. When I can sit down like that and knock out 10 of them, and had them at the radio station the next day, and the radio station owner was like, there's all. I didn't realize there was this much. He thought I might do 8 and be done with it. I said, I got 30 more that I'm not even fully completed writing yet. And so, but it's like that everywhere. It's in Polk, it's in Monroe, it's in McMinn. If you scratch it around enough, you'll find some really, really interesting stuff. So, anything else? Any other questions?
Do you have anything on Bull Kennedy?
Bull Kennedy? I'm sworn not to say anything about Bull Kennedy. Are you a relative?
He would be my great great uncle.
I might mention him in there some because of the Battle of Athens. But I've not written on him specifically. I think he had a son that just recently passed away within the past couple of weeks. The Kennedys, yeah, that's a pretty, you got some neat ancestors there, neat relatives. What? A nice adjective? Yeah. Hey, listen, they are intertwined so much in McMinn County history, a little down here too in Polk County, Monroe County history. So they were pivotal in the Battle of Athens. All those guys were. Otto and I said it was Otto and Bull, and there was another brother that was. I can't either.
Picture of their sister.
Yeah.
That's my great grandmother.
Okay. And there are several family members still left around. It's really neat. Yeah. Never written specifically about him because I'll have to be. There's a lot of people alive still. I'd have to be careful what I say.
I think they may have been carpenters as well, or cabinet makers, because we have 2 pie safes in the family that are supposed to have come through the Kennedy side.
They were pretty interesting guys, pretty talented in a lot of ways. So it's thank you. This is where the writing helps, just to, so you can say something. No, they weren't bad people. They were very interesting and exciting people. Those guys were. So especially Bull. Yeah. Interest varied. Yeah, he was police chief in Etowah for a while, and so I know some people that knew him. Yeah, you didn't mess with Bull.
My grandmother always swore that he was called to, what was it, Hillco, where he was killed?
I thought it was North Georgia.
I was thinking it was up in Hillco.
It may have been.
Shot him. Maybe he was shot more than once. I don't know.
Oh, so you don't believe in the car crash?
I don't know what to believe. My little grandmother was afraid of her own shadow.
Let me tell you a story straight to you when this is all over with.
Okay.
About his funeral.
Okay.
Yeah, and I'll let you take that with you from an eyewitness at his funeral about the car crash. Because it's interesting that you bring up. Not too many people mention a gunshot.
He could have been shot and then crashed. Well, that sounds right.
Yeah, I'll share that with you. What little I know about him. Anything else? Well, thank you all for coming down. If anybody wants to buy some books,
Joe, do you want to, how much of the
all of my books are $20. We just try to leave it at a single price. Makes it easy. There's no tax, nothing like that. Which one would you like? I think I know you. I know where to find you. I don't have a debit card. It's a machine. I take a check. Well, this is neat. More and more people are kind of coming up and saying, I can all work on that or how'd you like that?
Just sign it. Say your name in dark letter.
Is it common spelling?
Yeah. Charlie Roman. Yeah.
You want to play with the snakes?
Oh, okay.
Here you come, and you'll never see it.
Yeah, they will.
I've heard it from both ways.
What's it called?
I think maybe language got it or something. This one.
Neighbor, Herman, worked together on